The journey had taken days. The train cut through the European countryside like a slow-moving scar, its iron wheels grinding against the rails, echoing in the cold air. Inside one of the crowded carriages, a group of young Jewish women huddled together, wrapped in thin coats that barely shielded them from the chill. They had been transported many times before, between ghettos, camps, factories, but this time something felt different. The guards were American soldiers. Their uniforms were unfamiliar, their language foreign. Yet their faces did not bear the same hardened cruelty the women had grown used to. Through the slits of the wooden train, they caught glimpses of wide fields, towns untouched by bombardment, and roads filled with military convoys heading west. It was April 1945. Germany was collapsing. Hitler's Reich was on its last breath, and the Allies were sweeping through Europe. For these women, survivors of concentration camps, the end of the war had brought liberation but not clarity. They were still being moved, still counted, still watched. No one explained where they were going. When the train finally slowed, a voice called out in English, then repeated in broken German, "End of the line, everyone out." The doors slid open, letting in a sharp gust of spring air. Blinking against the sudden sunlight, the women stepped down one by one. Their feet met solid ground, not mud, not snow, not ash, just firm, dry earth. Ahead stood a fenced compound surrounded by tall wooden posts and barbed wire. But something about it was immediately unfamiliar. The fence looked orderly but not menacing. Watchtowers rose at intervals, but no machine guns were pointed at them. Soldiers stood by the gates, relaxed but vigilant. Trucks and jeeps rolled by in neat formation. The American flag fluttered overhead. For a moment, the women hesitated. Instinct told them to brace themselves, for shouting, for beatings, for dogs. That had always been the pattern. Arrival meant terror. Yet no blows came. No one screamed. An American officer with a clipboard barked orders to his men, not at the women. He gestured toward a line that had been prepared outside the main gate. Each woman was processed quickly, names, origins, short medical check. Some were too weak to stand on their own, and nurses in khaki uniforms helped them. The women stared at these nurses in disbelief. These were not SS women with riding crops and leather boots. They were young Americans with soft voices and clean faces. The compound itself was unlike any place the women had seen since before the war. Rows of low, barrack-like buildings stretched neatly across the field. The roofs were intact. The walls were freshly painted. There were no piles of corpses, no plumes of smoke, no acrid stench of burning. There was silence, broken only by the distant rumble of military vehicles and the occasional shout of a guard on duty. As the women shuffled forward, their eyes darted from one detail to another. A few caught sight of something that made them stop mid-step. Laundry hanging on lines, swaying gently in the breeze. White sheets, clean, crisp, impossibly bright. One woman covered her mouth with her hands, her shoulders trembling. Another whispered, "It can't be real." They passed through the gate and into the camp. Signs written in English marked different zones. Medical, housing, kitchen, administration. Everything was orderly, labeled, efficient. A group of German POWs marched past on the other side of the fence, working under American supervision. It took the women a few moments to realize the shocking truth. This was a prison, but not theirs. The camp was designed for captured enemy soldiers, but temporarily, sections had been repurposed to house displaced persons and liberated internees. It was a prison, yes, but an American one. Inside one of the barracks, the first group of women entered cautiously. The door creaked open, letting in a stream of sunlight that illuminated a scene that none of them had expected. The room was lined with rows of metal-framed beds. Each one had a mattress. Each mattress had clean sheets, white sheets, pillows, blankets folded with military precision. For several seconds, there was only silence. The women stood frozen, their eyes wide. Many had not slept on a real bed in years. Some had forgotten the feel of fabric against clean skin. A soft gasp escaped from someone in the back. Then another. A young woman pressed her hand against the sheet, as if to confirm it wasn't an illusion. Her fingers sank into the fabric. It was real, warm, smooth, clean. Tears welled up. One by one, the women began to cry. Not loudly, but with the quiet, uncontrollable sobs of people who had forgotten how to feel safe. A few sat down on the beds carefully, afraid they might be punished for touching something so pristine. Others remained standing, their bodies tense, their minds struggling to reconcile the image before them with everything they had endured. An American nurse approached, gesturing for them to set their belongings down. She spoke gently, slowly. "You can rest now," she said, not expecting them to understand every word. "You're safe here." The words washed over them, half understood but deeply felt. Safe. The concept itself felt alien. Some of the women exchanged glances, searching each other's faces for reassurance that this was real. Others stared at the beds as if they were relics from another lifetime. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, the camp settled into its evening routine. The women were shown where to wash, where to eat, and where they would sleep. Many obeyed mechanically, still in shock. Others walked slowly, absorbing every detail. The smell of soap, the clatter of tin trays in the mess hall, the orderly rows of bunks. These were all ordinary things, but to them they were extraordinary. They had walked through hell and emerged into a place that, by every rational measure, was still a prison. Yet compared to what they had known, it felt almost like a miracle. And for the first time in years, as night approached, they stood inside a room with beds and white sheets, their tears drying on their faces, unable to fully comprehend the strange, fragile peace that surrounded them. Night fell slowly over the compound, casting long shadows across the neat rows of barracks. The soundscape of the camp was unfamiliar to the women. There was no barking of dogs, no harsh commands in German, no gunshots in the distance. Instead, there were the muffled hums of generators, the occasional chatter of American guards, and the rhythmic steps of patrol boots on gravel. The stillness itself felt unnatural to them, like a trap laid in silence. Inside the women's quarters, the atmosphere was tense. The white sheets, the clean beds, the warm light from the electric bulbs. All of it seemed too perfect, almost theatrical. Many of the women refused to sit, instead standing against the walls with their bundles clutched tightly. Some stared suspiciously at the beds, their faces hardened by years of cruelty. Others whispered among themselves in Yiddish and German, trying to understand what kind of place this was. Was it really a prison? Was this some new trick by the Germans? Or had the war truly changed everything? In one corner, a young woman named Esther, no more than 20, stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the ceiling lamp. Its steady glow reminded her of the house she had lived in as a child, long before the ghetto, before the camps. She rubbed her arms instinctively, as if the light itself might burn her. Beside her, Miriam, older and more pragmatic, leaned against a bunk, her posture weary. "They say it's an American camp," Miriam whispered. "Maybe they want to keep us here for a while." Esther didn't respond. She was afraid that speaking might shatter the fragile sense of unreality that held the room together. Across the barracks, a small group began to argue in hushed tones. Some believed they were still prisoners, just under a different authority. Others dared to hope that this was the beginning of a new chapter. The debate grew tense, though no one raised their voice. They had learned to argue quietly, like people who had lived too long under watchful eyes. As soldiers outside began their night rounds, the women watched them through the windows. The guards walked calmly, their rifles slung over their shoulders, not pointed at anyone. They didn't yell or strike. When one soldier saw a group of women peering out, he simply nodded and kept walking. That small gesture unsettled them more than a shout would have. For years, every glance from a uniformed man had meant danger. Now it meant nothing or something they couldn't yet define. When a nurse entered carrying a tray with metal cups of warm liquid, the entire barracks stiffened. Dozens of eyes followed her every move. She placed the tray on a table and gestured for them to come forward. "Drink," she said in simple German. "It's soup." No one moved at first. The idea that food could be offered without strings attached was incomprehensible. Finally, an elderly woman stepped forward slowly, took a cup, and sniffed it cautiously. It was thin broth but warm and real. She sipped it, then another woman followed, and then another. Within minutes, the tray was empty. For many, it was the first hot liquid they'd tasted in weeks. Yet even as they ate, their bodies remained tense. Some hid portions in cloth, tucking food into their sleeves as they had done in the camps. Others glanced at the door, expecting someone to burst in and punish them for eating too much. Old instincts didn't fade overnight. Later that evening, when the lights were dimmed and soldiers made their final rounds, the women were instructed to rest. The nurse repeated, "You're safe here. Sleep." But sleep was not something they could summon easily. The beds, soft and warm, felt foreign. For years, they had slept on wooden planks, cold floors, or in overcrowded bunks where bodies pressed against each other for warmth. Now, lying alone in a clean bed felt almost frightening. Some refused to lie down at all, choosing instead to sit upright, backs against the wall, their eyes scanning the room in the dark. Others lay down cautiously, as if expecting the sheets to vanish beneath them. Esther lay flat on her back, staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound outside. A jeep starting, footsteps on gravel, the distant hum of a generator. Each noise made her flinch at first, then gradually her breathing began to slow. It wasn't comfort, not yet, but it was the absence of terror, and that in itself was disorienting. A few bunks away, Miriam whispered into the darkness, "Maybe this is real." Her voice was so soft it could have been mistaken for a thought. From the shadows came another whisper, trembling, "What if they send us back?" A silence followed. That was the question none of them wanted to confront. Freedom, after years of captivity, felt unstable, like ice beneath thin snow. As the night deepened, the collective weight of exhaustion overcame some of them. The first woman to fall asleep did so mid-sentence, her body giving in before her mind could catch up. One by one, others followed, though their sleep was restless. Dreams of camps, guards, and endless marches invaded their minds. More than once, someone woke up with a gasp, disoriented by the sight of a white sheet beneath her. In the darkest hours of the night, the barracks were filled with the soft chorus of uneasy breathing. Some whispered prayers in Hebrew. Others simply stared into the dark, unwilling to trust the comfort around them. The American guards outside walked their patrol routes, oblivious to the storm of conflicting emotions inside. Fear, hope, disbelief, grief. For these women, the first night in the American camp was not a night of peace. It was a night of quiet turmoil, a fragile bridge between the brutal world they had known and a new, uncertain reality they were still too afraid to believe in. Morning arrived quietly, with pale light seeping through the windows of the barracks. The women stirred slowly, blinking against the unfamiliar brightness. There was no shouting, no banging on doors, no roll call conducted by men with whips and guns. Instead, an American nurse stepped into the room and gently announced, in broken German, that breakfast would be served. Her tone was calm, almost ordinary. For the women, this ordinariness felt surreal. One by one, they sat up in their beds, their movements cautious and measured. Some smoothed the white sheets as if afraid they might be punished for wrinkling them. Others looked around in quiet disbelief, checking to see if the room was still real and not some cruel illusion that would vanish with daylight. Esther rubbed her eyes, still not used to waking up without the choking smell of smoke or the cries of guards echoing through the camp. Across from her, Miriam stretched her arms stiffly, her muscles sore from months of forced labor but no longer bound by fear. The women lined up outside the barracks. There were no snarling dogs, no barbed wire cages waiting at the end of the line. Just a mess hall with long wooden tables and the smell of food wafting through the air. Inside, soldiers and nurses moved with efficiency, distributing metal trays of porridge, bread, and weak coffee. It was simple, but it was more than most of them had seen in years. As they sat together, an odd silence filled the room. Normally, mealtime had been frantic, an animalistic scramble for scraps of bread or soup. Here, there was enough for everyone. No one fought. No one screamed. First, they didn't speak. The weight of their shared experiences had created an invisible barrier between them and this new world. But as spoons clinked softly against metal bowls, a few whispers began to emerge. A woman named Rosa, her voice hoarse from years of malnutrition, muttered, "It tastes like home." A quiet laugh, almost accidental, escaped from another woman. It wasn't a joyous laugh. It was fragile, hesitant, as if testing whether laughter was still allowed. After breakfast, groups were escorted to different areas of the camp. Some went to medical tents for checkups. Others were given clean clothes, simple garments but soft and intact. The act of changing into them was both liberating and unsettling. For many, the striped uniforms of the camps had become like a second skin, a mark of their identity as prisoners. To wear something else felt like shedding a part of themselves, even if that part was born of horror. Throughout the day, subtle bonds began to form. Two women who had shared a bunk in Auschwitz found each other again and clung to one another, crying softly in a corner. Others exchanged names for the first time in months, introducing themselves like strangers meeting after a long exile. Some helped the weaker ones wash or dress, instinctively taking on caretaking roles they had developed during years of survival. Inside the barracks, during the quieter hours of the afternoon, conversations deepened. Esther sat on her bunk beside Miriam, their voices low. "Do you think they'll let us leave?" Esther asked. Miriam hesitated. "I don't know," she replied honestly. "But this isn't the same. You can feel it." Her eyes scanned the room, noting how some women were sitting in groups, whispering, while others were carefully folding their new clothes as if preparing for something. Near the far wall, Rosa began softly humming a lullaby. First, no one paid attention. Then a few heads turned, their eyes wide with recognition. It was a song many of them had heard as children before the war. The melody drifted through the barracks like a ghost, fragile but persistent. One by one, voices joined in, hesitant at first, then stronger. The sound filled the space, not like a chorus, but like scattered pieces of memory reconnecting. Some cried as they sang. Others simply closed their eyes, letting the sound carry them back to a time that no longer existed. The act of singing together broke something open between them. Later that evening, as they returned from the mess hall, small clusters formed in the corners of the barracks. Women shared fragments of their stories, not the full horrors, not yet, but glimpses of who they had been. One revealed that she had been a teacher. Another used to play piano. A third confessed that she hadn't spoken her own name out loud in months. The names floated through the air like precious things. For years, they had survived by focusing on themselves, conserving every ounce of strength. Trust had been a luxury they couldn't afford. Now, in this strange new place, trust began to reemerge in small, fragile gestures. A shared piece of bread saved for later, a whispered prayer recited together before sleep, a hand placed gently on another's shoulder. Not everyone was ready. Some remained silent, sitting apart from the groups, their eyes distant and guarded. They had seen too much to believe easily. But even they could not entirely ignore the subtle change in the air. The barracks no longer felt like a place of mere waiting. It was becoming, slowly, a place where human connection was possible again. That night, the barracks hummed softly with whispers, songs, and prayers. No one knew what the future held, whether they would stay, leave, or be sent somewhere else. But for the first time in years, the bonds forming between them were not forged by fear, but by the quiet, tentative return of shared humanity. As the days passed, the rhythm of life inside the American camp became more structured. Meals were served at regular hours. Medical examinations were conducted systematically. Showers were scheduled. Clothes were laundered. For the first time in years, the women experienced a kind of routine that wasn't dictated by brutality or survival. Yet beneath this new order, emotions churned restlessly, like a river thawing after a long winter. Some adapted quickly, their bodies responding almost instinctively to the change. Rosa, whose lullaby had sparked the first communal song, began helping in the kitchen, her hands moving with a quiet diligence that surprised even herself. Esther and Miriam volunteered to assist the nurses, translating broken German for women who didn't understand English. The simple act of being asked to help, to contribute rather than just endure, filled them with a strange, fragile pride. Others, however, struggled. Anna, a woman in her 30s with hollow cheeks and sharp eyes, remained distant. She rarely spoke, preferring to sit near the window and watch the soldiers outside. Every truck that entered the camp, every group of prisoners marched through, made her tense. "They say this is temporary," she whispered one evening. "What happens when they move us again?" Her voice carried the weight of someone who had been moved too many times, each transfer worse than the last. These doubts were not hers alone. Whispers spread through the barracks at night, quiet and cautious. Some believed the Americans would send them back to their towns, though many of those towns no longer existed. Others feared they might be placed in new camps under new authorities. The future was a blank map, and blank maps frightened them more than barbed wire ever had. At least in the camps, cruelty had been predictable. Here, kindness was unfamiliar, and therefore suspicious. During one afternoon assembly, an American officer addressed the women with the help of a translator. He explained that they were in a displaced persons camp, a temporary refuge where liberated civilians would receive medical care and assistance until further relocation. His tone was firm but not threatening. "You are safe here," the translator repeated. "No one will harm you. This is not a prison for you." The words should have brought relief. Some women nodded cautiously, holding on to them like fragile talismans. Others stared blankly, their faces unreadable. Words of safety meant little to those who had seen promises shattered before. Later that evening, Esther sat with a small group by the barracks wall. The air was cool, carrying the distant sounds of trucks and the faint music of an American radio playing somewhere beyond the fence. "Do you think we'll ever go home?" she asked quietly. Miriam sighed. "Home doesn't exist anymore," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed a deep ache. Rosa looked up at the sky and whispered, "Maybe we'll make a new one." These conversations became common, small clusters forming after meals, late at night, or during walks around the compound. Some women spoke of their families, their lost lives, their hopes of finding surviving relatives. Others avoided the topic entirely, too afraid to stir the pain buried just beneath the surface. In these moments, a new kind of collective emotion began to emerge. Not just shared suffering, but shared uncertainty. One evening, a thunderstorm swept over the camp. Rain hammered against the roofs, wind howled through the barbed wire fences. The women huddled inside the barracks, their faces pale in the flickering electric light. The sound of thunder triggered something primal in many of them. Some crouched under their bunks instinctively, covering their heads, as if expecting bombs to fall. Others pressed their hands against their ears, rocking back and forth. The nurses rushed in, calming them, reassuring them that it was just a storm. But for these women, storms had always meant air raids, explosions, death. It took hours for the barracks to settle again. When the storm passed, a deep, contemplative silence followed. The women sat together in the dim light, soaked in the realization of how deeply the war had shaped them. Even in safety, their minds lived in fear. Even surrounded by kindness, they braced for cruelty. Slowly, in the days that followed, this shared understanding drew them closer. They began to comfort each other during sudden panic attacks, hold hands during roll calls, or sit together at night and speak softly about things they had never said aloud. It wasn't a grand transformation. It was quiet, almost invisible, but it was real. A nurse who had been watching them remarked to a fellow officer, "They look like people learning how to breathe again." She wasn't wrong. The women were relearning everything: how to eat without fear, how to sleep without dread, how to talk without whispering. Some days were easier. Others were heavy, filled with sudden tears and memories that clawed their way back to the surface. By the end of the first week, a subtle but undeniable shift had occurred. The barracks, once filled with suspicion and silence, now carried the faint hum of conversation, occasional laughter, and shared songs. The women still didn't know where they would go next. Their pasts were unalterable, their futures uncertain. But in the space between, in this strange American camp with its white sheets and orderly meals, they were beginning to feel again. Something they hadn't allowed themselves to do in years. Hope hadn't fully taken root. Fear still lingered like a shadow at the edges. But for the first time, hope and fear coexisted, not as enemies, but as two fragile halves of a new reality they were slowly learning to inhabit. Weeks slipped by like pages turning in a book none of them had ever read before. The camp, once alien and unsettling, became a strange kind of home. The white bedsheets that had initially made them cry now carried the scent of soap and human warmth. The meals no longer felt foreign. The guards, initially distant figures in crisp uniforms, had become familiar presences. Men with faces, voices, and small gestures of kindness that the women could finally notice. The women's bodies began to change first. Sunken cheeks slowly filled. Hollow eyes regained a fragile light. Skin once bruised and gray from malnutrition started to soften into tones of life. Hair, shaved or matted from years of neglect, was washed, trimmed, and brushed. To an outside observer, they might have looked like ordinary women again. But the war had carved itself too deeply to ever truly fade. Beneath these physical recoveries lay something far more complex, the slow, cautious rebuilding of their inner worlds. Every morning, the women lined up for roll call. It was a remnant of old routines, but here it was different. There was no screaming, no beating, no random disappearances. The American officers called their names, checked attendance, and dismissed them politely. At first, this simple civility was disorienting. Later, it became quietly grounding. Esther once whispered to Rosa after roll call, "I still flinch every time they say my name." Rosa squeezed her hand. "Me too. But at least, they say it as if it matters." In the evenings, the women gathered by the barracks or sat on the wooden steps outside, wrapped in wool blankets donated by relief agencies. The nights were cool, the stars bright and sharp in the European autumn sky. It was in these quiet hours that their minds wandered most, back to their homes, their families, their memories. The camp had given them physical safety, but memory was something no fence could contain. Some began writing letters to addresses that might no longer exist, unsure if anyone would read them. Others shared fragments of their stories, slowly, haltingly. Miriam told the group about her younger brother, taken away during the first deportations. Anna confessed that she had stopped believing in God 2 years earlier, but that lately, when the chapel bell rang in the distance, something stirred inside her again. These weren't grand confessions shouted into the night. They were soft, trembling admissions shared between people learning how to trust. The presence of hope was no longer foreign, but it was still fragile. Like glass, it could crack easily. Whenever new arrivals came, skeletal figures rescued from other camps, too weak to walk on their own, the older residents of the camp were reminded of where they had been. They saw their former selves in those newcomers. Blank stares, trembling hands, silent compliance. The women who had been in the camp for weeks found themselves instinctively helping the new ones, guiding them to showers, explaining routines, comforting them at night when nightmares tore through the barracks. In helping others, they unknowingly began to heal parts of themselves. Yet, as time passed, another kind of anxiety grew. The future. Rumors drifted through the camp like wind through tall grass. Some said they would be sent to America, others to newly formed refugee settlements. A few hoped to return to their hometowns. Others feared forced repatriation to places that no longer felt like home. Meetings were held, officials came and went, lists were read aloud in English, translated awkwardly into German, then whispered into Yiddish. Each announcement sent ripples through the camp. Some rejoiced, others broke down in tears. One morning, Esther received a letter through the Red Cross. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. It was from a cousin in Palestine, alive, safe, asking if she too had survived. For hours, she sat alone, clutching the letter to her chest, tears falling silently. When she finally shared the news, a wave of collective joy swept through the barracks. They had all lost so much that a single life found felt like a miracle. Moments like these revealed how deeply connected they had become. Grief had made them a group, Survival had kept them together. But hope was beginning to weave their lives into something new. The barracks were no longer merely shelters. They were communities of shared pain and shared resilience. Still, not everyone could move forward at the same pace. Some women were haunted by night terrors so intense that screams pierced the camp long after lights out. Others avoided conversations about the future, their eyes fixed on some invisible horizon. For these women, time moved differently. Healing was not uniform. It was uneven, unpredictable. The camp nurses and volunteers knew this, but they also saw something remarkable. Even those who struggled most were no longer entirely alone. There was always someone sitting beside them, holding a hand, singing softly, whispering that the war was over, even if their hearts weren't ready to believe it. As autumn deepened, the landscape around the camp began to change. Leaves turned gold and fell, blanketing the ground in quiet layers. Trucks came more frequently, taking some women away to new destinations. Each departure was bittersweet, a mix of relief for the departing and grief for the parting. "Maybe we'll meet again," they often said. And though none of them truly knew if that was possible, they said it anyway, because saying it made hope feel real. One evening, on the eve of a large transport to a resettlement center in France, the women gathered one last time outside the barracks. Rosa began humming the same lullaby she had sung on their first night. This time, the song didn't emerge from desperation. It rose from memory, unity, and a strange, tender defiance. One by one, voices joined in, until the air was filled with the soft, steady chorus of survivors. American soldiers paused to listen. Some lowered their heads. Others removed their caps in quiet respect. The sound carried into the night, mingling with the rustling leaves and distant engines. For a moment, the camp wasn't a temporary holding ground. It was a living, breathing testament to endurance. These women, who had once entered the camp in tears at the sight of white bedsheets, now stood together, singing beneath the stars, their voices fragile yet unbroken. Tomorrow would scatter them across continents. Some would reunite with family. Others would build entirely new lives. A few would never fully escape the shadows of the past. But on that night, under that sky, they were no longer just victims. They were a collective bound not by fences, but by memory, resilience, and the shared weight of tomorrow.